Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Okay, let's get started now with our final two sessions. Professor Hector. Ernst.
I'm not. That might be better. Hello. So I asked Professor Pick if this needed to be engaging, and she said no. My view is that good extemporaneous speaking is preferable to someone reading a paper, but that reading a paper is far preferable to bad extemporaneous speaking. And if you want, I can circulate the paper to you. It also has that benefit. So, figure out that. One way to explain why this text would be useful for an introduction to religion, I think, is to say something about its argument. The following remarks are thus organized around 8 points, the first 5 of which focus on the text itself, while the last 3 say something about why one would use this piece in an intro class. None of which are presented as they would be in an intro class, for what it's worth, and some of which draw on other texts in order to illuminate this point. We begin then with a handful of Troeltsch's own claims. 1. Troeltsch characterizes historical consciousness in terms of 3 interrelated commitments. The commitment A, to understanding candidate historical reconstructions as more or less probable, rather than as, say, simply reporting what happened. B, to assessing such probability primarily in terms of analogy. That is, roughly, in terms of a candidate reconstruction's consonance with the sort of thing that happens. And following this, C, to approaching all historical phenomena in this way, bar none, and so to treating all such phenomena as part of a single interconnected whole. Troeltsch contrasts historical consciousness, so construed, with what he terms dogmatism, the key characteristic of which is, quote, that it possesses an authority that, by definition, is separate from the total context of history. From this, it obviously follows that the dogmatic method cannot admit analogies or make use of them, because it would then have to surrender its own innermost nature, which consists in the denial of any analogical similarity between Christianity and other forms of religious development. Troeltsch claims that historical consciousness, so construed, this is 2, sorry. I would hate to mess up your name. Troeltsch claims that historical consciousness, so construed, challenges the naive certainty with which many believers hold to their religion. He claims, that is, that the form and content of religious belief tends to lead believers to assume that their religion is absolutely or ultimately true. With the rise of historical consciousness, however, such assumptions are increasingly put to the test, since all religious phenomena are treated as historical phenomena, and so as part of an interconnected whole, no exemptions. This leads, in turn, to a variety of attempts to validate what had been taken for granted, namely one's devotion to a religion as absolute. One such attempt, which Troeltsch characterizes as a supernatural apologetic, tries to validate such devotion by appeal to miracles, as if a supernatural power had provided such validation precisely by doing something extraordinary. Locke's reasonableness of Christianity is a notable example of such an approach. From a historical point of view, this approach isn't altogether promising, since A, miracles themselves are manifestly not the sort of thing that happens, such that an appeal to miracles is an appeal to that which is overwhelmingly improbable, and B, it runs into an obvious goose-gander problem vis-a-vis the supernatural claims of other religions, which makes it plain that such apologetics work just insofar as they exempt their religion from the interconnected whole of history. 3. Such failures make it evident that historical consciousness could validate religious certainty only after the religion in question had been thrown into the same historical hopper with all other phenomena, including other religions. This brings us to what Troeltsch calls the evolutionary apologetic, as exemplified in the work of Schleiermacher, Ritschl, and especially Hegel. I'll say something about Hegel's views in a moment, but before doing so, it might be helpful to consider a non-Hegelian example. Suppose a precocious preschooler wants to determine what the concept circle means, and does so by looking at the would-be circles drawn by her friends. Based on this investigation, she arrives at a definition of circle as a rounded, unbroken line, any given point on which is equidistant from a single center point. This, she takes it, is what everyone means to draw when they draw a circle, and thus what is meant by the concept. It's a very precocious person. If she's right about this, it follows that her definition is true in the sense of getting the concept itself right. She's not long satisfied by this outcome, however, since it occurs to her that her friends' would-be circles do not actually correspond to this definition, such that the latter is true only conceptually. This budding philosopher then sets out to find true circles, as she calls them, and is delighted whenever she happens upon one, in a soap bubble, let's say. For in such cases, her definition is true not only in itself, but in its actual correspondence to a concrete object. What this preschooler does for circles, Hegel means to do for religion. Hegel thus defends each of the following claims. A, that religion is human spirit's quest, so to speak, to be at home with itself in relation to divine spirit. B, that particular religions aim to achieve this sort of relation, such that the concept of religion can be seen as necessary, that is, as a universal and non-arbitrary standard with which to judge religions. C, that the Christian religion, properly interpreted, embodies this concept, for in Christianity, humanity is included in and so objectively reconciled with divine spirit, and humanity subjectively includes itself in this reconciliation, and so is at home with itself in relation to divine spirit. Hence, just as a dog show judge considers the extent to which a particular dog embodies its breed's standards of excellence, so Hegel here argues that a particular religion embodies that for which all religions are striving for. If so, then that religion can be regarded apparently non-arbitrarily as absolute. I have compared Hegel to a preschooler and a dog show judge. This is already a game for the study of religion. 4. Troeltsch argues that evolutionary apologetics like Hegel's fail by the standards of historical consciousness, since A, they are based on dubious history, and B, their validation of a particular religion turns out to rest upon an abstraction from that religion, such that here again we see a kind of residual dogmatism. Unpacking this a bit, Troeltsch first challenges apologetic appeals to religion, since the various phenomena gathered under that concept are far too diverse, he claims, to be subsumed under such a simple category, much less neatly ordered in terms of it. Troeltsch thus contends that history is, quote, an immeasurable, incomparable profusion of always new, unique, and hence individual tendencies, welling up from undiscovered depths and coming to light in unsuspected places and under different circumstances. From this it follows that history provides no basis which would allow all phenomena to be grasped imminently by means of an all-inclusive principle that would constitute, first, a law regulating the emergence and evolution of everything individual, second, and for this very reason, the essence and fulfillment of all genuine value, and third, the norm of all historical phenomena, end quote. On Troeltsch's account, historical phenomena, including religious phenomena, are akin to a Kantian manifold. Concepts are brought to bear on these phenomena in order to make sense of them, but it would be a mistake, Troeltsch thinks, to construe these conceptualizations as if they were out there in the phenomenal world itself. From this perspective, it's easy to see why religion could so readily be thought to warrant claims about the absoluteness of Christianity, and why such claims are ultimately confused, since the religion seemingly discovered by an apologist is precisely that which he or she put there. You pull the rabbit out of the hat that you put in there before you went on stage. Troeltsch presses a similar objection against evolutionary apologetics' understanding of Christianity. historical phenomena we might term Christian, Troeltsch insists, are likewise a manifold to which we might apply a concept like Christianity, but it would be a mistake to think that our concept is given to us by these phenomena rather than brought by us to them. Troeltsch maintains, therefore, that, quote, Christianity is itself a theoretical abstraction. It presents no historical uniformity, but displays a different character in every age, and is besides split up into many different denominations. Hence it can in no wise be represented as the finally attained unity and explanation of all that has gone before, such as religious speculation seeks. This objection applies, Troeltsch thinks, to anyone who would simply equate his or her understanding of Christianity with a historical phenomenon or set of such phenomena, and who therefore fails to see the active role he or she plays in constructing that which answers to this name. To be clear, this doesn't entail that one's conception is merely projected onto reality, nor that there can be nothing objective about such conceptions. It entails, rather, that one's conception should not be thought to speak the world's own language about itself, as it were, and that one should be on guard against simply projecting one's conceptions onto phenomena, especially when one then claims that that which is projected perfectly instantiates the essence or concept of religion. Troeltsch's verdict, then, is that evolutionary apologetics fail to provide historically credible validations of particular religions, especially insofar as this validation is based upon an abstraction from that religion. Fine. This raises an obvious, and for Troeltsch a pressing question, namely whether it is finally possible to derive a historically credible validation of a religion, or whether historicism entails a kind of debilitating relativism, as its critics have maintained. That brings us to Troeltsch's own four-step approach to this issue. What comes first is not so much a step as a point of departure, namely one's intuitive sense or feel for a religion, Christianity in Troeltsch's case, since this sense provides one with a sort of preliminary hypothesis about and means of discerning among the various phenomena that might count as such. The second step is to test this sense against the relevant phenomena, and so to determine the extent to which it accounts for them, the respects in which it is unduly partial, etc. One's initial feel for what counts as Christian is thus to be tested against and refined in light of a suitably wide range of historical phenomena. Even the most extensive testing, however, will not suffice to determine, finally, what counts as such, which brings us to Troeltsch's third step, one's own creative synthesis and appropriation of these phenomena, in which one brings these phenomena together in such a way that, ideally, this bringing together is simultaneously a recognizably personal, individual act. The idea here is that one should put one's own stamp on that which has been given to one, so that one's acceptance of certain historical deliverances would coincide with and give voice to one's individual self-expression. Naturally, if the historical deliverances were such that one could not experience such coincidence, then that religion would no longer be living or valid for one. This appropriation is not merely an individual affair, however, since one's own appropriation of Christianity itself becomes, or means to become, one of the phenomena that count as Christian, such that what others appropriate as Christianity can now include one's own appropriation of it. The fourth step, then, is taking if and when one's own synthesis contributes to the syntheses of others. At that point, one's appropriation is, quote, no longer merely a judgment about history, but itself a piece of history. And in it, the historical is newly formed and available for the future. Such appropriation, accordingly, is itself a constituent element of the continuing historical development of Christianity, and indeed one of the most important and crucial means by which it takes place. Troeltsch thus argues that insofar as one's synthesis coincides with one's individuality, such that that synthesis bears one's own characteristic stamp, then the relevant phenomena the phenomena relevant to other would-be synthesizers now includes one's individual novel expression, which, in combination with an ever-expanding array of other individual expressions, provides the synthesizer with new possibilities for his or her own self-expressive appropriation. On Troeltsch's account, then, the validity of a religion turns out to be a matter not of its rational necessity, but of its appropriability. That is, of the resources it provides for self-expressive appropriations, or personalizing appropriations, as sometimes says. If a religion continues to provide such resources, then it's valid. Likewise, if a particular appropriation of that religion provides such resources. I'm going to interrupt myself and point out that this is Troeltsch's final sort of approach to these issues, but it's important to know that he died trying to figure this out. What's that? Probably trying to figure it out. That's right. So be careful. So I think it's worth pointing out that Troeltsch was never his own disciple, and so he criticized this formulation too as insufficiently historically conscious of itself, right? And so the very notion of individual appropriation and personalism and so forth, he recognizes as themselves values of their time, right? So he doesn't want to make universalizing claims out of this either. So much by way of brief summary. We now turn to an even briefer explication of why one might use this text in an intro class. And here I will simply mention, but not elaborate, a handful of points. 1. Brief as it is, this text provides a helpful sketch of some important developments in the study of religion, a movement roughly from dogmatism to historicism, even as it contributes to those developments. 2. Given its thoroughgoing commitment to historical criticism and consequent opposition to exempting any religion from such criticism, the text helpfully establishes some parameters, or possible parameters, for secular, academic, non-confessional study of religion. And 3, the text surfaces some important issues raised by historicistic and secular academic study. For instance, how such study might approach judgments of validity, whether or to what extent it's compatible with religious belief, and on what grounds such belief must be validated. It seems to me then that there may be good reasons to use this text in an introductory course. I think there may be some reasons to worry about it. I didn't expect a laugh. I'm happy to talk about those, but I also hope there was good reason for you to listen to this paper, and I look forward to talking to you about it. So. Questions, comments, illuminations?
Can I ask one word second?
Yes.
What did you mean by it?
What I meant by it was meant to be limited and qualified by the adjectival use of non-confessional, and also meaning to point back to Troeltsch's claims about not exempting any religion from the same kind of critical scrutiny when it applies to others. So secular and very
sort of non-confessional, but academic is
right.
Yeah.
A sort of non-privileging principle of any perspective. You don't have really go. Yes.
Thanks for that. Would you talk a little bit about the optimal positioning of a course like this, of a text like this in a course that you teach? I mean, do you imagine this being the first thing, or something in the middle, or something at the end? And why?
So it's a great question, and I'm not sure I'm at all qualified to answer because I've never taught a course like this.
Well, this is your course.
So we should worry about that too.
No, I'm ready to hand it off. I'm up in the winter. I'm happy to toss it your way. But where would you put it? Seriously.
No, it's a great question. So where I situate this text in a course that I currently teach is it's after I've worked through Kant and Schleiermacher and Hegel and Feuerbach and worked through some of the issues that then Troeltsch becomes really useful as we're working through some of these issues. One of the other benefits of that is that Troeltsch then seems easy, right? And so I had a kind of optical illusion I was under when I chose this text. Because I remembered it as, right, when we get to it, it's after, all this horrible Hegel and stuff. And students are excited and feel like, oh, good, this is, things we can read. But now looking at it, I sort of think this might be horrible as a text for intro to religion for undergraduates, for instance. But that aside, I'm not sure where it would be helpful to include this, partly because my inclination is to think in terms of telling a sort of how did we get here story about the study of religion, and I think this text is pretty useful in telling part of that story and contributing to it. But I don't know. But I don't know where I would start if I were doing that, right? And that's a question that I find tricky, right? So I mean, the way I think you have to have some sense of what Troeltsch is responding to in order to see what move this makes and why it matters. Right. So I probably wouldn't start with it, but I'm not sure about an economical way of providing students with a sense of what this is a reaction to.
Can I just follow up?
Yeah, please.
That's interesting to me because I guess as you were laying this out, it seemed to me that the informing premise was that Troeltsch distills where we are now in some very meaningful way, and that you were doing it in such a way that while if you were teaching an intellectual history course, you'd need those earlier thinkers, but that the claim was, this is pretty close to the nub of where we're at in some very fundamental ways. And so I guess I realize now what I'm really asking is this standalone in some way possibly in this for you, in the sense that this really gets at what we're doing what we're talking about when we're talking about religion right now, to put it that way. And it seemed to me that was kind of the implicit claim of the presentation, which that's not a criticism, I'm just wondering if I've got you right.
No, that's good. So, I mean, if I were going to start with this, then I would want to think about how useful this would be as a way of opening up. Right. So, where has the study of religion gone from here, right? So, finer-grained historicism branches out from here. Yep. I mean, I think I'm not competent to teach the history of religions, but it usefully moves in the direction of talking about the story of the history of religions and its development. Even as in truth, right? So Troeltsch he goes to a period to study with Ritschl, studies with Ritschl, happens also to be working with some of the historians of religion, who, I mean, so if you're hearing Ritschl talk about the kingdom of God in one lecture hall, and Johannes Weiss talking about, no, that's completely wrong in another one, right? So Troeltsch talks about this as a student, the ways in which the history of religions really makes it impossible for him to sign on to the theology of his day. So, I mean, I think that's one direction to go after this. Another direction is to talk about critiques of bourgeois theology and approaches to religion, right, especially World War I, and then movements into dialectical theology and so forth, right, so kinds of rebellion against this kind of approach to religion, and then maybe look at some of the things that Troeltsch himself became most interested in was studying religion as a humanistic kind of endeavor, right, so the ways in which it sheds light on culture and human situation in various ways. But I don't know if that would gather together all that would need to be gathered together. So this is why I'm just not sure this would be a helpful way to frame things. Thank you. I appreciate the question.
I think this is another go at the same sort of question, or at least it follows from it. Given not only Troeltsch's distinctive location as seminal for historicism, but is also trying to do theology and is being progenitor to streams of theology. And your position as a theologian teaching this, I wonder what you'd have in mind to say in an intro to religions course about theology vis-a-vis where we are now. Because it seems like if anything defines or distinguishes religious studies in the last few decades, one of the few common denominators is, well, whatever it is, it's not theology.
Right.
And he's that he's sort of at the nub of this. He stands at that pivot point in an interesting way.
Right. Now, unfortunately, Troeltsch himself, his own theologizing itself, we can't make much use of because he never. So he felt that. So he leaves for Berlin, takes up a chair in philosophy, and stops working on theology proper at some point. And so there's less to work with from him as to what this theology would look like. We have his lectures, and it's very much in the vein of this this fourth kind of approach that I talked about, where there's these 4 steps, and you look at the humanizing dimensions of theology. I think, so if I were going to talk about theology vis-a-vis religious studies, I would want to emphasize that theology too should be understood as including more than just what it's portrayed as including, when religious studies is legitimated as a discipline in virtue of its not being that. And talk about one variety of this being this, I would call it a kind of theology of culture that Troeltsch engages in. But talk about other ways in which theology could be pursued without this sort of privileging stance that I think theology is often assumed to require. Right. So I think non-confessional theology is possible, in other words, and I think I would be happy to talk about that in an intro, of course.
Yeah, this may require more of an ethnographic analysis of the kids these days. So it seems to me that part of what Troeltsch is doing is trying to recover an apologetic. And how can one make a case for the absoluteness of religion in the midst of what we know about how history works, etc. And given, in general, the pluralistic, tolerant, post-everything 21st century college students, is this a sort of goal that will people understand? How can students understand largely what Troeltsch is after and try and sympathize with what he's trying to get at? Is that something you could sort of make compelling, I suppose?
Well, so that's a good question. I mean, one of the reasons that this is useful is because it raises this issue of kind of relativism. Here, let me. Troeltsch has a nice line about this. He's worried about historicism turning history into an incalculable welter of evanescent forms, as a result, historical impartiality seems guilty not so much of letting its light shine on the righteous and unrighteous alike, but of no longer recognizing this distinction at all. Right? So he's worried about that. And when I've taught this text, what's maybe interesting is students tend generally immediately to resonate with the critical aspects of it, right? So when he's criticizing supernatural apologetics, they're sort of glad, especially because they've just, they've come through all of these various apologetics, and they have a kind of visceral reaction against the way other religions are treated at the hands of these apologists, right? And so they're cheering when he says those things. And then he says, but we need to make sure we're not unable any longer to say anything about what would be valid beyond just what I happen to take as valid. And I think if I were to teach the whole text, part of one of its limitations and one of its features is that when Troeltsch finally gives us one of his first answers to this problem, it's exactly Ritschl's answer, right? So it turns out that we can botanize religions and order them according to the extent to which they see personhood as the highest good, and therefore can orient all of life toward personhood, right? And so students read this and they've been cheering for him, thinking, all right, now finally we're reading somebody who's not Stone Age. This person is finally getting it. They're up to date in some way. And then they get to this part where he talks in ways that they see as retrograde. And I sort of think that's useful, partly because it's worth seeing how difficult this problem is, right? And how difficult, even in someone who is so deeply committed to historical critical work over against dogmatism, just how difficult it is even for him in the same text where he's announcing these themes to get away from a certain kind of evolutionary apologetic, right? I think that's really useful, but I'm not sure that students are as worried about relativism when talked about in abstract terms as Troeltsch was. But I mean, I also think it's useful then, as a matter of historical fact, to bring in what comes right on the heels of these texts. And one of the serious issues raised against Troeltsch and theologians of his generation was, could they speak a critical word against the prevailing culture when it mattered most, right? And if they couldn't, then that was, by that very fact, a sign that something had gone wrong. And Troeltsch would say, you're right? I mean, so insofar as theology or religion can't muster any kind of critique of the prevailing culture, then there's evidence that something has gone wrong, and he wants very much to fight against that. But do you think in an intro class I would need to do additional work to help students feel that concern, or even just to wonder about the extent to which they actually do feel that as a live concern?
I'm not sure. I'm trying to figure it out myself. So.
Okay. You're not.
I think that would be necessary.
Okay.
I think a few examples can easily illustrate that. Like modern day examples of why this should be an issue for people.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it definitely needs to be made explicit.
I missed your first couple of opening remarks.
I did answer your question.
Maybe I know. So, just an impression. First, about this parasha of Troeltsch. That one of the things that's going on in the argument of this is that he's stating views and then he's ultimately going to refute them. Mm-hmm. And at least for this reader, plopped down in the middle of this, it was hard to see what's him and where he's disagreeing with Hegel and with others, and your elucidation was really helpful for that. I also just, anytime I pick up a text and it refers to the modern world, I think it might be the modern world, and this reads as so incredibly dated to me, this text. I mean, it just, of a world long ago and far away. And let me give an example and then raise the method point that I would like to raise. And maybe I've misread Troeltsch and maybe misread you. Likely both. But on the second page, the paragraph, it's easy to see how Christianity is affected by this mode of thought. And Christianity, like all great religious movements, has from the outset possessed a naive certainty as to its normative truth. And then goes on to say, apologetic reflections have fortified this confidence since the earliest times by contrasting Christianity with everything non-Christian as a whole. Mm-hmm. Well, that's just patently false, right? I mean, that in fact what Justin and other apologists do is they incorporate hugely. Justin argues that the Logos was proclaimed by Heraclitus and by Socrates, right? I mean, so Christian apologetics was not about carving out this absolute everything other. Now, the rhetoric of it sometimes does that, sounds like that, etc. So then when I get to the next paragraph, if I understand it, then the historical argument, or the, if you will, even the generosity of bringing Christianity within history of religions is that it's only one individual phenomenon alongside others. But that can reinforce for the student the idea that it's ever and thus been some separate, separable thing. And so, like, even with Wendy's presentation this morning on Hinduism, that the Hinduism and Muslim conflict, you can't understand Hinduism unless you understand those conflicts. Mm-hmm. So I guess this model, to me, is not a model of how one can then really do a kind of historically attuned understanding of any particular because you've already presumed that there's an isolation to it, I guess, or at least he has in this page.
Yeah.
So then religion becomes a category, and then there are these individual units.
Mm-hmm.
So then how does one teach in such a way as not to reify the boundary reference is the question.
Yeah, I mean, and it gets worse, right? I mean, so in other parts of the text, his principle of selection for what counts as a religion is the ones he has heard about. Because if they were any good, he would have heard of them.
That's honest.
At least he has, right. At least he says it. No, I mean, I think your point about that is right. And actually, in my notes about certain problems implicit in using this text, and if you wanted to use this responsibly, I'm inclined to say the first thing to do would be to get into the sort of logic of it, and then see where that leads you, where it would lead you if you were to subject his own approach even to that sort of approach, right? And that's why one of the things I said you'd want to follow this up with was, maybe use the phrase finer grained, more fine-grained historicism, but yeah, I mean, there's a lot that's still taken for granted here, I think against the grain of some of his better insights. Right, and so when he criticizes the concept of religion or the concept of Christianity, because it treats, this buzzing, blooming confusion of phenomena as if it were just this unitary thing that could correspond with an idea, that's just not true. And we need to see not just this idea over against these other ideas and treat them all as historical, but see all the ways in which these cross over and they're entangled and messy and so forth. Right? So I think on one hand I would absolutely grant the point, and grant the point about the datedness and grant the point just methodologically, but suggest that Troeltsch still offers, I think, a useful way of pressing for those kinds of concerns to be raised. And I think that's good though. That's helpful.
Okay. Thank you very much. Since we have an extra couple of minutes,
You're welcome.
I get to tell you my Franz Kafka story before I introduce Professor Hammerschlag, because my uncle reminded me of it this morning. So my great-grandmother, her brother, married Franz Kafka's second cousin. And their daughter remembers going to a Kafka family funeral, which my uncle said was Franz Kafka's funeral, but it wasn't. It was the day's funeral. And crying, she was a little girl, crying absolutely uncontrollably at the sight of Kafka's mother because she thought that this woman was a witch. She was absolutely convinced that by the way she looked and the way she presented herself that she was a witch. So you hear a lot about Kafka's father. I thought it might be interesting to have Kafka's mother's story for balance.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.